This is chapter 7, section 2, and it's on complex patterns of inheritance. And the idea is that phenotype is affected by many different factors. So, whenever we're talking about Mendel's pea plants, we were kind of making biology sound really pretty simple, as if things were as simple as, oh, dominant and recessive. But in reality, most traits in nature are actually determined by many different genes, or many different alleles even, or many different uh, versions of that gene. Or different alleles can interact in some different ways that aren't as simple as dominant or recessive. So that's what this section is getting into. The first idea is what's called incomplete dominance, and that's where neither allele or neither version of the gene is completely dominant, nor is it completely recessive. So to understand that, we'll kind of look at these pictures down here where you have this green looking fish and then this purple looking one, where we could call this green fish, let's say that this is capital R, and we'll say the purple one is lowercase r, and the one in the middle is the heterozygote, which is big R, little r. Normally, what would happen if we were just doing the simple, basic Mendelian genetics, we would, with the pea plants, it would say, okay, if you had both capital R, that would be dominant, so you'd be green. And if you had both of the recessive alleles, then you would be this blue color. And the heterozygote would look like the green fish. It would look green because it still has that dominant allele. But in incomplete dominance, you get kind of a blending of the two, where the heterozygote has a completely different phenotype or a completely different physical feature than the homozygous dominant and the homozygous recessive. So it's something of an intermediate. A somewhat similar idea, but slightly different, is the idea of codominant alleles. With codominant alleles, both are going to be completely expressed. Codominant alleles, just like incomplete dominance, neither allele is going to be dominant nor recessive. However, what's different with the codominant alleles is that you're going to have the presence of both of the different types of alleles. So let me walk through this example of blood typing, and I'll kind of contrast it with the incomplete dominance. So blood typing is the perfect example of codominance, where if you're blood type A, you're called blood type A because you have a gene that makes this protein called antigen A, where on all the surface of all of your red blood cells you have this antigen A. And so your genotype can look like this, where you have either 2 copies of antigen A or you only have 1 copy of antigen A. The other blood type, is going to be blood type B, where you have the gene that makes the antigen B, this right here, where your genotype can look like this, where you have 2 copies of the B allele or you only have 1. However, you can also have blood type A and B, where there's codominance, where you have the presence of both, the CO, that means together, so you have both of them. You have both antigen A and antigen B, so your genotype looks like this. So normal Mendelian genetics, the heterozygote, where you have both of the alleles, would look, typically one of these is dominant, one of these is recessive. In codominance, they're both dominant, so they're both present here. And then there's blood type O, where you don't have any antigens, where both of these versions of the gene don't produce one of the antigens. So what's different about codominance versus incomplete dominance is whenever you look at the heterozygote. So when you look at this AB here. So what happens with the AB is you have both of these present. Whereas if I go back to this one, the heterozygote was a mixture, was a blending. So in this example, if this was codominance instead of incomplete dominance, instead of the heterozygote being this silvery color, it would have patches almost like a calico cat, where like this patch right here might be green, this patch right here might be blue, and so on and so forth, where different portions of the fish would express one the color versus the other. Okay, then also related to blood typing is the idea that some genes are controlled by more than two alleles. So allele is just a different version of a gene, okay? And so with blood typing, you actually have three different alleles here that can come from one gene. So think of it as like, we'll call it, say we have a chromosome here, and we call it chromosome 1. You could say blood type A would be like 1 point A. If you're blood type B, you'd have the 1 point B allele, and then, blood type O would be like 1.0. If you have both of them, you're 1 point AB, where these genes, some genes aren't just gonna have two alleles that come from it. It's not just gonna be wrinkled around. It's you can have multiple different alleles that are gonna code for different traits. Okay, and then so we talked about multiple alleles. Well, there's also many traits that are known as polygenic traits. So poly meaning multiple, poly right here meaning multiple genes. So it's traits like eye color that aren't determined by one gene, like blood typing, but determined by multiple or more than two genes. So we don't completely know all of the genes that get involved with the color of your eyes, but it's kind of been narrowed down to most of it being determined by three genes, and these are their names right here, where the alleles have different levels of dominance. Okay, so you have brown, green, blue, where if you have blue eyes and you have you have three copies of the recessive blue allele from each of these genes. Where if you have brown eyes, you just have you'd have the brown dominant allele. Where if you have some of the recessive allele, it's where you kind of get into some of the shading. But the point here with polygenic traits is that there are certain traits that are just controlled by many different genes. It's not just one single gene that determines your eye color. Another idea is what's called epistatic gene interactions, where this phrase epi means above. So there's some sort of above or higher level interaction that's occurring with the genes, where let's imagine that there were 4 genes that determined the color of this porcupine here. This right here is an albino porcupine. So for individuals that have albinism, there's multiple genes, we'll call it 4, that determine the skin color. However, if you have one of those genes where both copies from mom and then from dad, of that gene, if you have the homozygous recessive, say we'll call it we'll just use R again, little r, little r. If you have the homozygous recessive, the protein that comes from both of these genes, proteins that come from both of these genes, will feed back to those other three genes and prevent them from producing those pigment molecules that determine normal skin color. So going back to this definition here, an epistatic gene, this gene here, can interfere with other genes. So it makes a protein from this gene that will go and will affect the production of proteins, pigment molecule proteins, from these other 3 genes that would normally those genes would make the different skin color, but instead it has this homozygous recessive copy of the proteins from this one gene that's blocking the production of the other genes. The final concept is that the phenotype, or the physical features of these traits are a combination of the genotype, your genes, and your environment. Meaning that really most traits, be it behavior, things like your height, and even for sea turtles, the sex of the sea turtle is determined by a mixture of the genetics, your genes, and then the environment that you're brought up in. So for sea turtles, for humans, uh, what determines the sex of an individual is going to be the sex chromosomes. If you're XX, you're female, you're XY, you're male. For sea turtles, what determines the sex is going to be determined by the genes, so the sex chromosomes, but also the environment. So whenever these sea turtles lay their eggs, the eggs that are closer, that aren't buried as deep in this sand, are going to be male, and the eggs that get buried further down in the sand, so they're going to be a little bit cooler, they're going to be female. Kind of interesting. Another example of gene and environment is going to be height. So, normally if your parents are tall, you're going to be tall. However, height is also affected by the environment. So just because your parents are really tall, if they have you as a child and you don't get the proper nutrition that you need, then you won't necessarily become, as tall as them or even taller because you didn't get the proper nutrition from your environment as a kid. Okay, so I'll do it for this section.